Hello and welcome. This is Ryan Hillier reporting for the NB Media Co-op from Moncton. Today, we bring you a discussion on unpaid internships within the field of social work in Canada. A social worker and grad student who lives in Fredericton recently launched a petition in which she described the practice of unpaid internships as exploitative and inconsistent with the standards of internships in other fields. For more on this, we spoke to officials from two major national bodies in the social work field, Fred Phelps of the Canadian Association of Social Workers and Carol Carpeau of the Canadian Association of Social Work Education. We'll hear from them in a moment. But first, Julia Strang is the author of the petition. She spoke to the NB Media Co-op on Thursday. What motivated you to create and share your petition calling for the end of unpaid internships?
Well, it really stemmed from a snow day. I had a bit of time to pause and reflect last Monday, when the weather kind of came upon us. And I had had a conversation with someone close to me who was in a very similar situation. They were also working, studying full time, and completing an internship. The only difference was, so we were feeling very much in solidarity, but the difference came to be when they let me know that they were being paid and a pretty reasonable hourly wage for a student, I felt like. So they were being pretty fairly compensated for their time, where social work students are generally expected to work for free. So this was something that kind of broke a dam within me. And I thought, I'd love to sign a petition. And I did the scan that I've done kind of annually since starting in the social work education, to see what was out there and if people were talking about this. And there were some articles, actually some pretty recent ones from November, but no petitions or nothing that felt tangible. So I thought I would just kind of put my words down and see if anyone felt the same and create a petition.
Great. And you said that you're on your third unpaid internship. Could you talk a little bit about your experiences in social work and your background getting into this field?
Yeah, so I would say I've noticed in looking into it that there is a bit of a distinction between practicum and internship, and practicum does seem to be focused more on learning and shadowing and kind of taking a backseat, very student oriented role. So in my Bachelor of Social Work, there are two internships. I believe they're around 360 hours each. And those felt very much like a practicum. Like, it's a lot of focus on learning and education. But now into the master's degree, I would say that we are very much more in an internship role. It's a lot of independence and taking on tasks and doing the truly the role of the work that you would be looking to do after graduation, which is very exciting, and it's a awesome opportunity for so much learning. I think just the unpaid portion makes it so hard for people to get by, to balance working, studying in the evenings, and then doing this placement. And the way they're structured depends on the university, but mine is throughout the entire school year and it's a couple days a week. So it really does, take up quite a significant chunk of your work week.
Hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned in your petition that the role of accreditation organizations. Should you talk a little bit about the way that you feel that they have, I guess, not incentivized this, but allowed it to continue?
Yeah, well, I actually reached out to the CASWE, which is our accrediting body, and they did express that the decision was left to individual schools and that it wasn't something that they mandated. Um, and they did bring up the point as well that oftentimes, and I'd heard this from my school when this was brought up by students as a concern, that keeping all practicums unpaid is something that's done in an effort to ensure equity across the board. But I don't think that that ever really sits well with the people on the receiving end because even though it's fair, it doesn't necessarily mean equity by my definition, at least. Kind of feels as though the thinking is if no one is paid, then the burden is shared equally, but it's not. It certainly weighs heavier on students with fewer financial resources. I'm sure I would say that most, if not all, social worker students are pretty strained financially, but some do have the ability to rely on family or are able to balance paid work with school. Others are not. And students who come from lower income backgrounds maybe aren't able to then participate in the program. Maybe this is a deal breaker for them. And then it's our loss because we lose those students from marginalized groups, oftentimes from lower income backgrounds. And the social work program is less rich for not having those people able to participate in our school.
Yeah, and we had spoken with Fred Phelps from the CASW, who we were talking about the fact that demand for social work is set to increase quite exponentially with a lot of the challenges that are going to be faced by Canadian society more generally. Could you talk a little bit about I guess what you see as the necessary kind of changes that you would like to see in order to incentivize people to get into the social work field and what needs to happen in your view? It's a big question.
No, absolutely. And I think I was thinking about that question earlier, and it's something that was kind of thrust upon me. You don't necessarily realize when you're getting into it. You assume that there would be a practicum component, but the unpaid dimension is not front of mind as a student until you're experiencing it. And you do hear as well that, oh, with your master's degree, there's whispers that you can be paid for your practicum, and I think that that is dependent on your university. Certainly, mine cites that there would have to be exceptional circumstances to be paid for it. Um, and so I'm not sure what those circumstances would be, but also that would then further limit where you do your practicum. Maybe you're extremely passionate about working at an NGO that wouldn't pay you, but you need to be paid. So you end up working for a larger organization that's less close to your values, your interests. I think, the response that I've gotten from the organizing bodies that I've reached out to has been that this is something that's definitely on everyone's minds. It's being thought about and considered, and they're in the process of developing a stance on the topic. But I think, these are people who have clearly they stated that they spent a lot of time thinking about it. So I would love to hear what their thoughts are. It seems like I'm curious if they're thinking in terms of why we shouldn't pay students or if they're looking for reasons why we should, because I think there are some really good ones if we were to consider it from that angle. And of course, like I think probably the biggest argument or the clearest argument is that the Canadian Association of Social Workers, we have a code of ethics that really compels social workers to challenge systemic inequities, and unpaid internships are a pretty prominent one that contradict this ethical mandate and create a financial barrier that disproportionately affects marginalized students. So I think that this is something that we need our associations to advocate for and to stand with us and help us appeal to federal bodies and also to our own institutions.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, when we spoke with CASW, I did note on their website that the first line in the code of ethics is inherent respect for the worth of the person, and inherent dignity is the key phrase. And I did ask the question of, well, social workers are trained to have inherent respect the inherent dignity in all persons, and yet we have this situation where social workers themselves, such as yourself, are not feeling that, you're not feeling the worth of their work. Um, and what have you heard from maybe some of the other people in your field that you've spoken to after you put out this petition?
I would describe most of my peers as suffering in silence. It seems like almost something that you have to endure as a rite of passage. It's not really talked about because it is so undignified. Like we're all working really hard in these frontline positions. We're registered social workers. We get paid for the work we do elsewhere. And if we were to do similar work elsewhere, we would be paid. So it's almost this like choice of like this just trying to put it aside from your mind, knowing it's just a set amount of time we just have to endure. But that endurance is really waning. And I think once you break the floodgates a bit and start the conversation, giving an outlet, even in the petition in the comments, it's so interesting to read people just vocalizing their exhaustion and how pushed to the brink they are. I think it's really sad and it's quite shameful that we would allow people to work this way and to live this way in Canada in 2025. And I think it's very revealing that this is a female-dominated industry, and we kind of just expect women to accept this and just take it on the chin and keep carrying on, knowing that, it'll be behind you soon. And it feels like it will be behind you soon, and you won't have to really think about it again. But it sets you up to be worse off when you get into your career. You've probably taken on even more debt. Um, I think you put a lot of value in the relationships you build during your practicum, and there's so much value to that, and perhaps it will lead to a job. Um, but there should also be payment on top of that. And I think women can be criticized for not asking for raises, or there's all sorts of like business analytics of women not faring as well in the workplace for reasons that they're kind of blamed for. And so this is one example of an instance where I'd like for us to kind of band together and say this is not acceptable. It's actually quite shameful and it needs to change now. There's something going on in Australia where they're piloting a program of giving stipends to students, and that was cited to me by Fred in his response email, which I think is fantastic. But I don't think Canada needs to wait for Australia to gather data and a couple more years of compiling that and analyzing it before we decide to do something. We can pilot our own prayer program quite easily. That would be a fantastic social work practicum.
Yeah, excellent. That really covers everything that I wanted to ask you, and I guess if there's anything else that you wanted to add, please feel free.
Gosh, I mean, I hope that I said it all and not too much rambling, but yeah, I think that social work is an essential service, and I think it's really valued by the people who are engaged in it and who are receiving services, but it's really difficult um, to see it be not seen that way on a larger scale. Like we have doctors completing residencies, lawyers articling, engineers doing co-ops, and no one would ever question them being paid for these long exhausting processes that where they're so clearly doing work. So for social workers not to be afforded that same dignity, it's really quite shocking for a lot of people to learn, and it's shocking to be a part of.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and for sharing your petition and for your response. And we look forward to continuing to cover this story.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Carol Carpeau is the executive director of the Canadian Association of Social Work Education, which is a professional accreditation body for social work education programs in Canada. She says unpaid internships represent a clear issue in terms of equity. She also described her own experience practicing social work while studying and raising her children. But she cautions that social work faculties in various agencies that employ social workers are under financial pressure. The NB Media Co-op's David Gordon Koch interviewed her on Wednesday.
First of all, Carol, what's the role of the CASWE in the education and accreditation of social workers?
So we're the accrediting body. So the profession, basically, we have three pillars of the profession, and we are the educators. And our main mandate is the accreditation of social work programs in Canada.
Mhm.
So bachelor's and master's, BSW and MSW programs.
Maybe you could speak about a little bit about the importance of practicums in the education of social work. How important are these in your view?
Absolutely. I think the goal is to have a um, balanced educational path. So students, once they graduate, are ready for the many hurdles and challenges in social work practice. And that's a large scope. So, of course, part of what students learn during their studies is, I would say, more academic. And then there's a very significant piece in terms of practice and learning how to practice. So the learning piece comes through this practicum, which really allows students to be out in the field. Um, and supervised as well, because they are supervised for a certain number of hours. For a bachelor student, that's 700 hours of practicum. So that's very significant uh, in their journey to become practitioners.
And I know that you're aware of this petition. Uh, you received a copy from the social work student, Julia Strang. What's your take on this movement to end unpaid internships in the field?
Absolutely. I did receive a copy. I offered to meet with Julia. This is a topic which we've been discussing in again within the pillars, specifically with practitioners. So it's at the forefront as well of our minds, but also we are, I would say, trying to identify pathways to advocacy and what that would mean. There are clear issues in terms of equity, access to education, right? Those hours are unpaid hours most of the time, and that's certainly something we need to reflect on and consider. I know that it's very challenging for students. I'm myself an educator, and I know that students are really sometimes put in difficult situations. It's also the compounding effect. I think this is also in terms of equity for students coming from equity deserving groups. For example, it adds to the many barriers that they might face to access education. I also feel that there's a gender piece that we cannot deny. In other fields, such as engineering, which are more male dominated, for example, we know that it's more attainable in terms of having an internship which would be paid. So this is truly an issue. Um,
Mhm.
and as I said, I think we're not only open to dialogue, but identifying ways forward and what can we do really to potentially bring about a shift. Um,
Yeah, and just
as
to jump in there, sorry to interrupt, but you noted. I just wanted to note you mentioned equity seeking groups, and that this is that there's a gender piece here, and I think that you're referring to the fact that this is a largely women dominated field, correct? And so, um, unlike in fields such as engineering or the skilled trades, it seems that in many of these fields and sort of caring professions, nursing, perhaps, or social work, I think midwifery might be another example. There's uh, isn't opportunities to get aren't as many, at least, opportunities to get paid as one does work in the field as a practicum. Is that right?
I think that's accurate. Now, I do want to highlight, as you said, not as many. So I think that's one point I wanted to clarify. In our educational policies and accreditation standard, nothing prevents practicums from being paid.
Mm.
Right? And there's a reason why this is not in our policies. So this is doable. From the accreditation standpoint, we do not in any way prevent this from happening.
Mhm.
Some students manage are successful in having a paid practicum, and I know, of course, from working from schools all over Canada, that schools are actually very supportive of those efforts, and they would really try to support their students in being able to reach their goals in a way that is also supporting their overall well-being. So it does happen. It's certainly more challenging and not, I would say, in a majority of cases. Unfortunately, it is an unpaid practicum. I think the question here, because we were talking about other fields, we need to recognize that in those cases where we have paid internships, they are paid by an employer, right? They are paid by businesses. Um, and that's the question at the forefront of my mind. I mean, no doubt in terms of the challenges and issues in terms of equity and the toll this can take on students. I see it every day. My question becomes, and I think our question becomes, who then could pay for those practicums?
Mhm.
And I think this is where we all trying to um, see where we could have those conversations and who we could engage. I think from our perspective, we would not want to add financial burden to social work programs, social work faculties, to agencies who host our students, or to employers. I mean, social work faculties in the country are under dire financial stress at the moment. We're in an austerity austerity times where many of the universities are now freezing hiring, adjusting programming, adjusting content. I know from doing this work every day, that there's actually a crisis in the field where, right, it's so difficult even to have students being placed because agencies are also facing the same challenges. Field instructors are not being paid to do this additional work, right? It's a huge responsibility, additional hours, and they're not being paid more because agencies can't. So in my mind, the next conversation probably is going to be with federal stakeholders, both from seeing what other countries are doing, but where is we need to find pockets of funding for this. I think that's the fundamental question.
Right. And just to jump in there, it's been noted that there's international precedent. There's a new program in Australia providing compensation for practicums in areas dominated by women, such as midwifery, social work, nursing, and so on. Um, do you see something like this, some kind of a federal funding model, as a good policy option that should be pursued in Canada?
We are at the infancy of determining, as CASWI, but also perhaps at CASWI and CSW with practitioners and other stakeholders in the profession, what we could do and who we could talk to. I think it would be a valid option to explore. I know that some universities right now are also turning towards bursary or specific co-op programs, and those are connected to federal funding. So again, it's at the beginning, so we don't know where this will go and if they will be successful, but I think it's a path worth exploring. We can also discuss subsidizing practicums, right? There's an excellent program, the Canada Summer Job Program, where employers are subsidized. Could it be a similar program that we can implement for practicums? So I think this is really the beginning, but I could see conversations going this way, and it's certainly an option worth exploring.
Mhm. And so you mentioned that you work in education, and you see the struggles that students are going through, correct? Can you just describe briefly a little bit about what the student experience is like or can be like under certain pressures, especially from people with, as you mentioned, who are from equity-seeking groups, or, who have maybe multiple barriers to this kind of thing. We've heard about, for example, people who are working their way through university, doing paid work as well as studying, and then having to take time off of their paid job to pursue a practicum, an unpaid practicum. So, is this something that you've seen among students, or could you just talk briefly about, what it's like to be a social work student in these, conditions of austerity that you spoke about a moment ago?
Yes, not only am I seeing it, but I've been through it myself. I went back to education and to an MSW later in life with two younger children, having to do a practicum and having to work as well. So I have experienced it firsthand, and it creates, as I said, the impact on mental health, well-being, um, anxiety that it creates, from lack of sleep to right? It truly is, speaking from a very personal perspective, something that I will never forget, that will stay with me for a long time. And I think when I see students today in my class, there is increased pressure overall in terms of accessibility and education. More and more students typically have to work at the same time. We know all of this: inflation, cost of housing. There's more and more pressure, and I think this is another layer. Another very real layer, because at the same time, students, this practice piece is absolutely necessary. Um, it's social work is a professional um, position. It's also a position where we work with human beings. right? So we need that piece in terms of how do we approach practice, being prepared to this very unique work, very relational work, and that's actually one of the recommendations which we have. We have students who are in paid placements, and our main recommendation is to make sure that that learning piece is happening, right? Because when you're hired, typically you are expected to come with that competency, which is different with students. So that's also an angle which we really want to focus on, because we wouldn't want that piece to get lost. So again, it's really finding that balance where students can increase their well-being and at the same time be prepared to what being a social worker is. So this is the fine line, right? Not compromising, but at the same time, alleviating some of the anxiety, the fear, the pressure in terms of money, um, um, and life, right? We also have some of them, like me, children, or caring for family members. It can be very, very overwhelming and can really impact your experience as a student.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for that. Is there anything you'd like to add, Carol, before we wrap up?
I think I'm looking forward to more conversations. It's a crucial topic which we need to address. Uh, I would not want us to address it in silos. I think there are many connections here in terms of broader access to education, alleviating hurdles to equity. I think there's so much more, the field itself, that we need to discuss. So I hope we can do this work in collaboration with other partners in social work, but also at the government level and with students. I think it's great that students are also sharing with us and trusting us to be on this path with them. So we're looking forward to that. Hopefully, we can be facilitators of change. That's what social work is about.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for speaking to the NB Media Co-op today. Carol Carpeau, Executive Director of the Canadian Association for Social Work Education. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day.
Finally, we go now to an interview with Fred Phelps, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. We spoke about the nature of social work, the challenges faced by interns, and the future of this profession. He said the organization, which represents more than 20,000 social workers, doesn't currently have a policy on the issue of unpaid internships, but they're looking into the issue. CASW is looking at advocating for policy options that might include the creation of a new financial resource similar to the Canada Summer Jobs Wage Subsidy Program to avoid putting more pressure on the various organizations that employ social workers. We'll go to that interview now. So I guess I'd like to start off just by getting your response to Julia's petition. What were your initial thoughts?
Well, if I could take a step back first and just talk about Canadian Association of Social Workers. So we're the association voice of the profession in Canada. So we represent about 20,500 social workers across Canada. And each of our members are of the 10 associations across Canada. So in New Brunswick, it's the New Brunswick Association of Social Workers that are our members. And as a federation, we work as consensus on a consensus model. So when we develop policy or positions or social justice advocacy on the national level, because that is our area of jurisdiction is national, we look to our provinces and our provincial partners and territorial partners to determine how we move forward on policy, and we do that by consensus. So on this particular topic, it is a topic that is one that has been around for a long time, given that unpaid practicums are really, in some ways, a major burden on social workers that are looking to advance in the profession. And so we don't, at this time, have a consensus position. So we don't have a position statement on paid practicums as a national association. That said, it was brought to our federation last June, so June 2024, to look at what we might advance as a position on paid practicums. And so we were given kind of the green light by the Federation to investigate and look into paid practicums and what that might look like from a national perspective.
Okay. So ultimately, who has the authority over determining the compensation levels for social workers in Canada? Like, where does the buck stop?
That's a very difficult question as a federation in terms of Canada, right? And so there are different layers of government that support post-secondary education in Canada. There's provincial levels, and then there's the federal level. The Canada Social Transfer supports both social services and post-secondary education, the transfer from the federal government to the provincial governments. What we look to explore as in terms of paid practicums is that we're kind of not the instructions, but the parameters in what we're looking at is we're not looking to create a kind of a financial burden on employers. It's very difficult for employers to take on practicums themselves. But our advocacy, I think, would be centered around creating a new federal funding source to support agencies and students to apply to cover the costs of practicum wages. We envision something similar to the Canada Summer Jobs Program. And we think that would be, and again, we don't have a position yet. It hasn't been defined, but this is kind of the direction that we have thought to look at. In terms of this, there's an international kind of a precedent for this, and the context is in 2024, I think in May last year, Australia announced a new, what they called a Commonwealth prac payment, and that was to support social work, nursing, midwifery, in terms of devising a way to support professional practicums typically dominated by women. And that's, I think, is a key factor in this, is that there are paid practicums, paid co-ops, paid internships in the male-dominated fields and trades and tech and in engineering. But in terms of those professions that are predominantly women-focused or women to uptake or dominated by women, there isn't paid practicum. That's an equity piece, and that's a piece in which that we, as a national association, look to address and advance as we develop a position on paid practicums.
Hmm. So I guess that would, yeah, lead to my next question, which is about the nature of social work. Like, how is social work defined? There are many, obviously, contained fields, but just in a general sense, what defines social work? And speaking to the gender disparity issue, what are the particular challenges that are faced by women, and what fields within social work do women typically take on?
Well, the scope of practice for social work is varied and pretty wide in terms of regulation of the profession, that's done on the provincial level. So all social workers, for example, in New Brunswick, that identify as social worker as a registered social worker and work within the scope of social work must be registered with the New Brunswick Association of Social Workers. And New Brunswick plays the role of both, an integrated role of both the association role in promoting and strengthening the profession and the regulatory role in terms of regulating the profession. So the scope of practice is very wide in social work. So you have social workers working in school systems, you have social workers in hospitals and primary care, interdisciplinary teams and healthcare teams. You have social workers in corrections, in child welfare. It's a very wide spectrum in which social workers. When I say predominantly, most in terms of similar to nursing and other helping professions, it's typically dominated by women in terms of caring for and working with and supporting community. And what I would say, probably without full numbers, 80 to 20% in terms of that. And I think similar to every other way in which the system has not been set up to support women, both the professions that support community, because we're looking at social services, community services, the support networks. Those typically, unfortunately, are the ones that are on the block quicker than other other programs. And so that's probably what the piece. But I think moving forward, to advance the equity piece and recognize that the services of social workers and other fields dominated by women are valued, if not should be valued more in terms of supporting community, in terms of advancing the social, in terms of health, and what we call the upstream, ensuring that we support communities and families before there's crisis, before there is a situation in which that emergency services are needed, which end up being much more expensive. So there's a lot to be said on this, and I think there's one aspect that has to be, there is the educational piece, right? Well, we're not the education role of the profession. There's 40 plus schools of social work of Canada that establish the standards of accreditation for each school of social work for what social workers are required to have before they graduate. And part of that requirement is practicums. And so we would have to work with the educators, the Canadian Association for Social Work Education. And I imagine we'd have to also work with the Canadian Council of Social Work Regulators, that each of their partner organizations regulate the profession. So this would be really an interprofessional, interpillar or intersectoral advancing of something as a concept of paid practicums. It's not an easy piece to move forward, but it is certainly, in terms of equity, in terms of moving the profession forward and demonstrating value for both the work that's completed and the people in whom we serve. That's something that we will most likely support as we move forward. Again, don't have a consensus position on it, so I can't really speak to it in terms of it being the defined position of CSW.
Yeah, of course, of course. And yeah, I guess Julia's petition, she stated that accrediting bodies have long justified this practice of unpaid internships as the only affordable way to offer placements. So I guess that kind of speaks to what you were just mentioning, is accrediting bodies, and those accrediting bodies. Can you just talk a little bit about following up with what you were just speaking on, following up with the accrediting bodies?
A paid practicum. So a practicum itself is oversaw by a school of social work, so by field placement practicum supervisors, and is arranged by that school of social work. And so on the other side, you have an employer that is matched with that person to be able to complete a practicum. There is an immense amount of work that goes into supporting a practicum. So it's not even just the economic piece; it's supporting an employer to support somebody in their learning. While that person is providing a valued contribution to the team of a practicum, they are learning and completing. And so again, I think what we're looking at is not placing that burden on the schools of social work to pay that, and looking at employers to have to pay that, because we are very much aware that schools of social work struggle in terms of funding. The funding comes from the federal government, but predominantly by the provincial government. And so you'd have to look at advocating to each provincial government to support practicums within their jurisdiction, not a national piece, right? And so again, where I think we would end up heading if as we're developing a position on this, is looking to the federal government to do a transfer to the schools of social work, a transfer to the provincial level to support practicums in female-dominated and including social work. That's where we would be advocating. And it would be similar, I think, something similar to the Canada Jobs Program that could be administered nationally. And so if schools of social work choose to go down that road, then employers or schools of social work would be able to apply. Again, this is all theoretical in terms of how that might play out, because we certainly don't have a defined position on it as of yet. But I think each individual school of social work has depending on their capacity as a school to meet that financial, would be that, again, an equity piece where one school may be able to manage, but another school might not be able to manage. So we'd have to look at how equitably you could fund something that would support people. And oftentimes students that are in schools of social work are providing either working half-time or full-time while they're doing their degree, often have to take time off work to do a paid practicum, to do an unpaid practicum. So there's a lot of arguments that can be made, that should be made to advance the concept of a paid practicum. How it's paid for will probably be the hardest piece advancing the concept is easy. Advancing the economic benefit of doing so and getting a level of government to fund it will be the difficult piece.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we've seen that just from municipal level across the country. There's a lot of budget pressure, municipal budgets, and the alignment between municipal, provincial, and federal on some of these social issues has really come to the focus in the recent past couple of years. So, um, I guess yeah, we could move to talking maybe about the future picture for social work. And on your website it mentions that between I think 2025 and 2029 there's projected to be quite a growth in the demand for social workers. So what does the picture look like going forward? The next 5 years, and how is the association looking to respond to that? Maybe you kind of already answered that, but maybe a little bit on the future of social work.
Yeah, the future of social work is I want to say bright. That's all right piece, but social work unfortunately is needed more and more, and will continue to be needed more and more on the full spectrum of the scope of practice, from the classroom to to hospitals, to community centers, and to child welfare and child protection. Supporting families and communities will certainly be an increase. And social workers are one of the largest, if not the largest provider of mental health services in Canada. So you ask about looking ahead future-wise. Took us about 8 years and a few governments nationally. We advocated for student loan forgiveness for social workers that live in and work in rural and remote Canada. We were successful in the last budget to get that. It hasn't moved through regulations, so we're a little nervous that with the proroguing of Parliament and the some regulations not having gone through the expansion of those types of programs. So we're looking at both the Conservatives and NDP to look at their support, if they so become the next government, to when there is an election, to commit to advancing that. So doctors and nurses already have that. Took us 8 years of advocating, just to give you perspective on how long it takes to manage to pull something through and have meetings with government and slowly advance an issue. So the student loan forgiveness piece, one piece in terms of us supporting and looking to how can we support social workers and future social workers to live, work, and be in the communities that they want to be in, and the communities that need them. And so student loan forgiveness was one. Moving forward, we really need a comprehensive view, a comprehensive perspective of the profession. Back in 2004, 2003 was the last time we were funded federally to look at the social work profession and to be able to look at where social workers were working. You asked of our scope, where we're working, our social workers, what areas of field, where should we be looking to be training social workers for, given the numbers of supports that are needed, whether it be mental health or primary care or child welfare. We just don't at this point have a good understanding nationally of what our future health and human resources needs are for the profession. So that's the second piece, the student loan, and then sector study, really looking at our sector. And then the third piece within this, within our current strategic plan as an organization that ends in 2028, we'll be looking at paid practicums as another piece of supporting. And these are all pieces, knowing that there are a shortage of social workers in many parts of Canada already. And unless we really have the fundamentals and understand and are able to plan based on what we know, and a lot of what we don't know at this point is the difficult piece to navigate in terms of addressing health and human resources for the profession moving forward.
Yeah, I mean that's a very realistic assessment. I guess I would follow up with what's your optimistic outlook? Like, what makes you optimistic about the future of social work in Canada?
What makes me optimistic is as social workers are everywhere. We support community everywhere, and we will continue to support community everywhere. And I know, and what excites me is that seeing students come up with a social justice lens, social workers coming up with an equity lens, social workers coming up to ensure that we have a just society, that we move forward and demand a more equitable society. That's what makes me excited about the profession. We'll continue to do so. And social workers, like the student who is advancing paid practicums, demonstrate to us that social workers are still trying their best to fight against the system, support a system to gain more support for social workers, but also more support for the communities, the families in which that we get the honor to work with.
Yeah, I guess in Julia's petition, she noted that in speaking to that comment, well, on the CASW website, it says, the core values section is something that I found really interesting. And the first one is the respect for the inherent dignity and worth of persons. And so the kind of contradiction between what, Julia's statements regarding, her feelings toward the unpaid, practicums is I think it is in contradiction with that core value. So how, I guess you could speak to how you wanna go forward in giving the inherent dignity to social workers, whereas, their core value is giving the inherent dignity to the people that they serve.
Yeah, so I think I go back to the beginning of the conversation and advancing this as an equity issue, as unpaid labor, and it is an equity issue when you put it in relations to male-dominated fields such as trades, like tech and engineering, that are normally they have play placements or co-ops, and that speaks more of volumes than the of the not of the profession, but of how society itself and how the funding mechanisms in society value different professions over other professions. And that I think is a much larger issue than just the School of Social Work or just paid practicums. And I think I don't want to say just because that is a value proposition, but I think that really is uh, if you step back, a recognition that male-dominated fields have been valued more so than female-dominated fields. That building community has been less valued in terms of building it in terms of people and strength of community and versus the bricks and mortar aspect of building community has been valued over. So with Julia, I very much agree in terms of the equity piece, and we'll continue to fight for that. The inherent dignity of all people will continue to fight for that. And I think there is a certain aspect of inequity that comes with unpaid practicums. And again, that's a systemic piece that we will look to address. But I don't think that is inherent in the structure of the schools of social work. It's more a reflection of what is valued and has traditionally been valued, and that we need to continue to challenge and move that forward.
Excellent, yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time for this conversation. I guess if there's anything else, that you wanna add, feel free to do so.
No, I'm good right now. Thank you very much, Ryan, for your time, and thanks for your interest on this topic, as it is a very important topic to continue to advance both at the national, provincial, and provincial levels.
Excellent, and we'll look forward to hearing more about the CASW doing that. So,
Perfect.
yeah, we'll conclude here. Um, my name is Ryan Hillier. I've been speaking with Fred Phelps, who's the executive director of the Canadian Association for Social Workers. You've been speaking with the NB Media Co-op. Thank you.